For this podcast, we're going to be looking at the Gospel of Matthew. Some important things to know about the Gospel of Matthew is that we have long attributed the Gospel of Matthew to the disciple Matthew. That may not be entirely accurate, although the influence of Matthew on this work is very important to the story. Some things to know and understand. The Gospel according to Matthew was written around 85 AD. Matthew was murdered in 60 AD. So Matthew had been dead 25 years before the Gospel of Matthew was written. So that's kind of important. You know, Jesus died around 30 AD. Jesus was born about 4 BCE, but died about 34 years old, which would have been in the year 30 AD. The very first disciple to be murdered after Jesus's murder was James, the brother of John, who was murdered in the year 44 AD, just 14 years after Jesus. The disciple James was the first to be murdered. The second and third disciples to be murdered were Andrew and Matthew. So Matthew was either the second disciple to be murdered or the third disciple to be murdered. Andrew and Matthew were both murdered in the year 60 AD. And the next disciple to be murdered would be Simon the Zealot, who was murdered in the year 61. So Matthew was either the second or the third disciple to be murdered about 25 years before the Gospel of Matthew was written. Now, the very, very oldest known writing about the things Jesus said has been attributed to Matthew. So it is believed that the very oldest writings of the things Jesus said was written by Matthew. And if you're looking into research of where the gospel writings came from, the oldest documents, you will hear people talk about document Q. That's how this has officially been labeled by historians and theologians and philosophers. So document Q is this oldest document that is believed. We can't prove it. You can't prove any of this. You can go through all of the books of the Bible and you can't prove that any of them were written by anybody. You really can't. It's all theories and hypotheses. We can't prove any of that. But what we believe to be true is that this document Q is the authentic writings of Matthew. Now, the Gospel of Matthew was written, we believe, using this document Q, these oldest writings of Matthew, and the Gospel according to Mark, which we also don't think was written by this person actually named Mark. We believe the Gospel of Mark was written by the community that surrounded Peter. So Simon Peter's group or community around him, someone in that community had to have had a high-level, sophisticated Greek education and written and oral communication skills in order to write at such a high level of Greek. Because when you look at the very oldest manuscripts of Mark and Luke and John and Matthew, all 4 of these Gospels, the very oldest known examples of these texts were written in very, very high level Greek. So, and the composition and the sophistication of it is such that it's highly unlikely that someone was speaking in Aramaic to someone who then translated it to this high level of Greek. It probably wouldn't happen that way. And for the great similarities in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, for that to happen 3 different times and come out so similarly is highly unlikely. But the Gospel of Matthew is unique for many reasons. It is believed that both Matthew and Luke were written by having access to the Gospel of Mark and this document Q, which would be, we think, the very oldest known writings about Jesus, and we believe these were the writings of Matthew. Now, it's probably someone that was in the Matthew community, we call it the Matthean community, who actually wrote the Gospel according to Matthew, which would be 25 years after Matthew's death. Now, for that to have happened, there had to be someone in Matthew's community that was educated in Greek. So while we look at Matthew and we say Matthew is special because it's a first-hand account, well, that might not actually true. It might be a second-hand account if it is someone writing because of their conversations and knowledge of Matthew, or using this document that we call today document Q, which are believed to be the authentic writings of Matthew. Before we get into the discussion of today's particular gospel, I want us to just look very briefly at the 4 gospels together: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. While we have traditionally thought of these as being written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that may not actually be exactly true. When we look at Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and in the earliest manuscripts that are found, they appear to be written in a very high level of Greek, which would not be an easy task for people that basically spoke Aramaic. And that would have been their primary language at that time. And their writing skills may not have been up to the task. And in their later years, the likelihood that they would have learned Greek to the point of being able to write in Greek and to be able to write in a very educated level of Greek is also probably not accurate. It is probably true that whoever the real authentic author of the 4 gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, came from a community like a community around Matthew, a community around Peter, a community around Paul, and a community around John. So these gospels more than likely are from these 4 communities of the disciples: Matthew, Peter, Paul, and John. Now, it is currently believed that the books of Luke and Mark were written first, and then the book that we have as the Gospel of Matthew was written later. It is also believed that Luke and Acts were written together as one and were later split, and that the book of John would come up after that. Any quotations that were made from these books that we know as the 4 Gospels, they were referenced as the memoirs of the apostles. They did not get the names Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John attached to them until sometime between 120 AD and 185 AD. 185 AD is the first time where we see the book of Matthew is actually being referenced as Matthew writing this, Matthew saying this. And that came from a gentleman who wasn't all that well received, but that's where it first began. One of the theories is that along about the second century, the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Peter began to be circulating, and there were some yeah, there's some funny things going on with those. We're not sure those are authentic, but it's like, okay, everybody knew the name Peter and Thomas, but these other four Gospels did not have a name. And so one of the theories is they put names on them, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, to give them credibility to kind of contradict the problems they were having with the Gospel of Thomas and Peter. I hope that gave you some more background information, because when we're looking at any one of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they all have a similar controversy. Not a controversy so much that we're going to say they're garbage and they're all made up, but the controversy as to who actually wrote them. And Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John probably were not the authors of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. I have often thought that Luke might actually be the author of Matthew, and that Luke might be actually the author of John. So that's just some thoughts that I have. And whoever wrote Mark, perhaps after they had access to document Q, then wrote Luke. So that's my theory and my hypothesis. My theory and hypothesis is that perhaps Luke is the author of Matthew and John, and that some other educated Greek person is the author of Mark, and then when they had access to his document Q, they wrote Luke. And this would also be someone who probably traveled in the circles of both Mark and Paul based on that. So anyway, do I have any proof of that? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. So let's go ahead and get into the book of Matthew. And there are a couple of my own writings that I want to focus on first off. Several years ago, I wrote a book called A Deeper Calling, Beatitudes, Attitudes of Being, which are focused on the writings that we find in Matthew on the Beatitudes. Although I claim to be a follower of Jesus, I'm not a follower of a lot of these political organizations we have today that want to post the 10 Commandments in every schoolhouse and post them in the courthouse and all this, because I think that's ridiculous. Why would I want to post these 10 laws given to the people from Moses in places where it's not apt to make a difference? I mean, posting the 10 Commandments will make absolutely no difference to anyone. Also, if you're looking at posting them in places that are supposed to be a separation from religion and politics, then why would we impose that on other people? And the thinking for that is because if a different religion was in power politically, would we want their documents and beliefs imposed on us and our children? And the answer to that is no. And of course, we can get very arrogant, says, yeah, but that don't matter because we're right and they're wrong. No, that's not the way that works, people. That's not the way that works, people. And so anyway, in fact, you can go into, these churches where you have all these yahoos running around in politics, demanding that we post the 10 Commandments in schools, and you go to their churches and just go in every single room in that church. Are the 10 Commandments posted on the walls of every room in that church? No. In fact, you probably won't find them anywhere in the church unless it's a children's Sunday school class where they happen to be studying Moses. So anyway, and so um, I wrote this book several years ago when I was having a little Facebook war with one of my cousins over the Ten Commandments. And I just made the comment, well, why would we care if the Ten Commandments are there? If you really want to make a difference, why don't we post the Beatitudes, actual words from Jesus that actually mean something, that actually give us direction on how we should live and treat people? And so I was having a conversation with my ex-wife. This was around the pandemic times, and she was going for cancer treatments. And so I drove her to these places where I wasn't always allowed to go up into the buildings at that time because of COVID. But I was driving her to these places until she became familiar with traffic patterns and parking and one-way streets until she could do it herself. And I was telling her about this conversation I had with my cousin, which this particular cousin actually went to school with my ex-wife, and they knew each other before I met her. And so anyway, she said, "Why don't you write a book on that? That's a book I would like." So I wrote this book because my ex-wife says, "Why don't you write a book on that?" And so I did. And it's a very, very small book. It's no longer in print. It's more. It's so short that it's more an essay. It's too big to be a pamphlet, and it's not really big enough to be a book. So it's a published essay, really. But I think it's about 60 pages, something like that. But it's looking at the Beatitudes of Jesus. It's not available anymore. It's one of my books that did not sell very well, but if anyone is interested, I have created a PDF version of this. I'll be happy to send anyone who wants it. So if you would like a copy of this for free, I can get that to you in PDF version. Maybe someday I'll get a second printing of a bunch of these and just carry them around to give away. I gave them away to a lot of my seniors group at church. Actually, the cover of this is actually a photo taken by one of the members of my seniors group who uh, goes out for a walk every morning, and he posts his pictures. And this picture was so beautiful and spoke to me. And it was while I was writing this, and I asked him, I said, "Hey, could I have permission to use that for a book cover?" And he sent me a high resolution image of that. And so that is a picture taken by my friend Gary Hudson during one of his morning walks. And that's a park out there, I believe, near Eldridge Highway 6 area. And there's a park out there where he walks. I have it written in there where it's from. But anyway, so a lot of the talk about the Beatitudes, basically, if I wanted to talk about Matthew, I probably would talk mostly about the Beatitudes, because that's the words of Jesus. And in my theory as to the authorship of Matthew, where this oldest document, Q, has the words of Jesus, when you're reading about the Beatitudes, those are important words from Jesus. Now, I don't know for a fact that those were part of this document Q, but I would like to think they were. And so when I think of these, I'm kind of thinking, okay, I'm thinking these words from Jesus were written down and recorded by Matthew. And so when I look at the Beatitudes, I do think about Matthew. Okay. Uh, I have a section in my book, Deep and Wide, for all of the books of the Bible. Some of you know I started writing this book in 1994, and I finished it during the pandemic, finally, getting all the final things done to it. It did go through a second edition and some revisions after some of the political changes that happened in 2016. While I was writing some of these devotionals, I was talking about, well, people are running scared because they think such and such is going to happen, and it's not going to happen. Well, some of the things I said back in the early 2000s that would not happen politically actually did happen after 2016. And so I did have to change 2 or 3 of the devotionals in here because I stated stuff could never happen that actually did happen. So that's one of the reasons that this book took a second edition. And so I might need to cut out a lot of this garbage that I'm talking about right now and get back into it. But to start with this, I want to read from my devotional that I have for August 22nd. And this devotional for August 22nd is on page 390 and 391 of my book, Deep and Wide. And to start with this, I actually started by posting, not the Ten Commandments, but posting the uh, the Beatitudes, and I did that from the Living Bible. So this is Matthew 5, verses 3 through 11 from the Living Bible. Humble men are very fortunate, he told them, for the kingdom of heaven is given to them. Those who mourn are fortunate, for they shall be comforted. The meek and lowly are fortunate, for the whole wide world belongs to them. Happy are those who long to be just and good, for they shall be completely satisfied. Happy are the kind and merciful, for they shall be shown mercy. Happy are those whose hearts are pure, for they shall see God. I like that one. Happy are those whose hearts are pure. You know, it's important to have clean hands and a pure heart, you know, your motives. I believe in the judgment day, that's what we will truly be judged on. Our motives. Are our hands clean? Was our heart pure? Happy are those who strive for peace. They shall be called the sons of God. Happy are those who are persecuted because they are good, for the kingdom of heaven is theirs. When you are reviled and persecuted and lied about because you are my followers, wonderful. And then here are a few of my thoughts following that I included in the devotional for August 22nd. I often think that the Beatitudes need more exposure. The Ten Commandments are posted in many places and are received with great reverence. Shouldn't the Beatitudes be as important or even more so? The Ten Commandments are the foundations for the rules. The Beatitudes are the foundations for how we should live. Jesus shared these words with his disciples to teach them about priorities in living. He taught them and us that we need to be humble, meek, just, and good, kind and merciful, have pure hearts, and seek peace. When we are sad, mocked, rejected, and hated, we are uplifted because of why. Through our rejection, our messages are confirmed by God. When people call us names, make fun of us, insult us, or tell us we are not loved by God, we know that is not true. God created us and God loves us and God wants to use us to share the truth about God's inclusive love. A person, church, family, or political organization that rejects us because of who we are, our genetic material, our immutable traits or characteristics are not of God. If they do not know and understand the inclusive love of God and refuse to listen to truth, then you cannot continue to stick with them. If they continue to reject you, refuse to listen to truth, wipe the dust from your sandals, and spend your life on earth with those who do follow the life and lessons of Jesus. And I also want to read the prayer that I wrote for that day. God, help me see beyond the rejections that I receive. Help me see the grace and value that you give to me through these acts of rejection. Help me to express and show kindness, humility, peacefulness, and all actual characteristics of integrity. Help me to, in fact, be what I say I am, so that when I share my truths, my reputation opens a space for people to listen. Amen. I also want to look at a little piece from my devotional I wrote for August 24th, where I'm still in Matthew chapter 5. You have heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. If you love those who love you, that's easy, right? What reward will you get? If you greet only your brothers, what are you doing more than others? So if you only love the people just like you, if you only let people just like you into your church, what are you doing? There's no reward in that. The concept of this is my writing. The concept of inclusive love was missing so often in the Old Testament that Jesus was not wasting any time trying to repair the damage of their embedded racism and egocentrism. Although the Old Testament commanded them to love their neighbor, they put a lot of limitations on that word. They were very selective in who they included as a neighbor. Jesus gets right to work helping them understand that everyone around them are their neighbors. The prostitute at the well is their neighbor. The Samaritans, whom they considered below them, are their neighbors. The people who hate them are their neighbors. Our enemies are our neighbors too. We are called to love our enemies too. If we never spend any time with people who are not just like us, then how are we able to share the inclusive love of God? If all of our social interactions are exclusive, then how will we learn to love those who are different? Simple, we won't and we cannot. In order to move beyond love only in concept, we have to get to know people so that we accept them and accept their truth, embrace them, and include them. And just like I've done in the other Gospels, you really cannot move beyond the work of a gospel without looking at the story of Jesus being confronted by the religious leaders, the religious people. They were doing just like what these political yahoos are doing today. You know, we got to get them 10 commandments posted on the wall, and it's like, well, just and they went after Jesus and says, okay, don't you believe any of these 10 commandments? But we got to understand the religious leaders at Jesus' time were not just about the 10 commandments. They had like 363 rules that the people had to follow, and everybody had to miss one or two of those. So basically, if you wanted to, you could condemn everybody. So if you look hard enough, you can find reason to get rid of anybody you don't like, because you have so many rules that they have to follow that you can find fault with everyone. But they came to Jesus again and said, okay, what is the most important? Jesus tells us that we do not need all the laws, rules, regulations, procedures that occupy hundreds of pages of the Old Testament law. He repeats this many times as expected, because this is the reason he needed to come. Jesus again quotes scriptures from the Jewish text in Deuteronomy and Leviticus. The most important commandments are to: 1, love God with your whole being; 2, love all people no matter what. Then Jesus elaborates that none of the other rules and laws are needed, because if you follow just these 2 commandments, then all that you do will be okay. You do not need the law that says thou shalt not kill, because you cannot murder someone if you are loving them as God commanded. All of our rules and laws hinge on just these 2. If we are loving God and loving all people, we will not care if the centurion was a gay man or not. Our job is to love him as our neighbor and let God direct his path as God directs ours. So that is my look at the Gospel of Matthew. And there's lots of information in there, but like I shared with you when I first started this 4 weeks of looking at the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, in the order of Luke, Mark, Matthew, John, that I didn't want to look at the repetitive text, although this which is the greatest commandment, is a repetitive thing that I have addressed in each of Luke, Mark, and Matthew. But when I look at Matthew, I think about, the attribution, the attribution of the Gospel of Matthew to this person, Matthew. And I think about what we do know, that there is this oldest document that's just simply a listing of things Jesus said, this document Q, that is believed to be the authentic writings of Matthew. And then somewhere along the year 85 AD, after what we call Luke and Mark, which probably were not written by Luke and Mark, but after those two documents were written. And my theory is that someone who was within Paul's circle, Paul and Peter's circle of influence or community, was a gifted, highly educated Greek writer. And my belief is that that person wrote Mark, and then when they had access to Q, they wrote Luke. So, and then my theory is that Luke actually is the author of Matthew and John. So anyway, this is my focus on Matthew. When I think of Matthew, while there's lots of things to read and discuss and understand in the gospel according to Matthew, or whoever the authentic author of that collection is, I focus in on this section of the Beatitudes. When I think of Matthew, I think of the Beatitudes, because we could pretty much base all of our theology, all of our church rules, if we feel like we have to have church rules, which that's an issue I have as well. But we can base all of that. All of our theology could come from the Sermon on the Mount. I mean, it's laid out, it's clear. It talks about the loopholes that as human beings, humans look for loopholes and ways to get around stuff. And that's where it's at. If we spent, I, probably like me, you probably have some favorites as well. I mean, my kind of thought is if we preached every Sunday using the sayings of Jesus, specifically the Sermon on the Mount and the parables of Jesus and the writings in the book of James in the Bible, that would be a huge improvement. We have the collection of writings that we call the Bible, but that we look at. But when we're if we're reading to discuss the lives of people that have lived before us and their challenges and how we can learn from that, there's lots of good stories in there to engage with. But if we're talking about how we're supposed to live today, then we pretty much could focus on the book of Matthew and the book of James. Now, don't misinterpret what I just said, because I know there are people out there that are already ready to fire off a message to me telling me on everything you disagree about what I just said. But you're going to disagree about stuff I didn't actually say. I did not say that none of the Bible is worth anything except for Matthew and James. No, what I said is if we focused nearly all of our time with the book of Matthew and James, that would be a good thing. And if we're looking at church theology and how we're to treat other people, if we focused on Matthew and James, we would be just fine with just those two books. Now, I did not say the rest is garbage and throw it out. I didn't say that. Okay. Thank you for watching today. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to Words to Ponder for more like this and other topical podcast discussions.